Hey everyone, welcome back to another hardware news recap for the week. In this one, we have more NVIDIA news as things approach launch. NVIDIA's partners have continued the leaky ship theme that NVIDIA has, unfortunately for it, had this past quarter or so. Intel drops the ball on a major supercomputer, pushing back dates and potentially shifting its source of manufacturing for the CPUs going in that supercomputer. Cryorig has a very brief announcement that we'll talk about. They've been gone for a long time, but they're trying to come back. Corsair filing for an IPO, looking to go public. TSMC's Technology Symposium, and more. Before that, this video is brought to you by Team Group and its new Vulkan SSD. The Team Vulkan is available from 250 gigabytes up to 1 terabyte, with the 1 terabyte drives now priced at only around $100. The Team Vulkan is a simple blackout design that focuses on a mix of performance and value for DIY PC builds. Solid-state storage has gotten affordable, so learn more at the link in the description below. Oh, and they're also doing a never too much RGB giveaway that we'll link below as well. So the first news story this week is actually news from actually NVIDIA, not just a rumor this time like it's been, well, it seems like for about 6 months now. This time, NVIDIA published a video via its GeForce YouTube channel that was entitled The Remarkable Art and Science of Modern Graphics Card Design. The video offers some details on the design process of upcoming cards and how this process has evolved over the years. It's also worth mentioning that NVIDIA hasn't specifically confirmed any model names or SKUs here, but it's subtly confirming some of the leaks that have emerged over the past few months. The video starts off with a crash course in thermal dynamics from David Haley, one of NVIDIA's thermal architects. Haley goes on to mention that as the GPU has evolved, so too have the challenges of removing heat from the GPU. Haley goes on to say that to offer a focus on keeping video cards cool and not being ridiculously loud, NVIDIA had to overhaul its PCB design, cooling design, and software stack driving the GPU. This is all stuff we're actually really excited to test, so typically with reference cards, there's kind of a baseline of performance you expect as a reviewer, and it's not very good. And then as the partner cards come out, you start to see the issues that are present on the reference cards for early launch, for enthusiasts at least, go away with those partner models. In this one though, the reference board is probably the most exciting from a testing perspective because there's just so much that can be done with it. There's a lot of feature testing we can do with the interesting layout of NVIDIA's RTX supposedly 3000 series reference coolers that we've seen so far. Andrew Bell, NVIDIA's VP of Product Design, also in the video detailed how NVIDIA's mechanical engineers take new cooling designs and ambitions and transform them into something that can be manufactured and shipped in volume. Traditionally, GPU coolers are fixed to the PCB through springs. Certainly, if you've watched our channel long enough, you've seen our teardowns where most of the screws are spring tension screws. And then we've also done videos in the past that we can show of Cooler Masters manufacturing facilities where they were putting together, at the time it was NVIDIA Quadro cards. So you can see some of the assembly process. A lot of it is actually manual. You'd think most of the screw installation would be automated at this point, but depending on which card design you're talking about and the volume of that design, there's a good amount of manual effort involved where people have to actually go through and do the finishing touches. One of these places is with those spring tension screws that hold the cold plate to the GPU. So where some of the others can be automated around the back of the PCB, often the 4 screws that actually secure the cold plate to the GPU silicon, those are touched up by technicians in the factory to make sure that the mounting pressure isn't too hot. So we'll be curious to see if that's changed with this one. But either way, in this video, NVIDIA outlined how it has developed a new leaf spring with a shorter profile to bring the cooling solution closer to the PCB and also allow for a backplate. Next in the video, NVIDIA's Director of System Engineering discusses the challenges of funneling an increasing amount of power into a PCB and dealing with the resulting power density. It's here that NVIDIA talks about freeing up space on the PCB and adding layers to the PCB to mitigate crosstalk, where you see signal corruption and degradation between wires in close proximity, or traces in close proximity. This is where NVIDIA also talks about the idea behind its 12-pin power connector. The 12-pin power connector is smaller than a traditional 8-pin power connector, but is also rated for more power. And there's a few reasons for this. We've talked about this in the past, but when the 12-pin first started getting discussion, a lot of people were like, well, but they already do 8 and 8. They do 2 8s, so that's 16. Isn't that more power? It's not. There's other things involved. Like wire gauge, for example, and the overall spec of the connector, the pinout too. So anyway, they were talking about the 12-pin in this video, and the 12-pin connector will be mounted to the PCB in a vertical orientation, which saves a little bit more space on the PCB itself. The 12-pin connector will also be compatible with 8-pin connectors, and that will be with an included adapter. There's also been a lot of chatter around this decision to move to the 12-pin, and just to re-emphasize points that we've previously made, the board partners are still free to use whatever they want, and in speaking with many of them, it sounds like the plan is still to use traditional 2x8 for a lot of the higher end cards, or 6 and 8, where the power of the GPU, the requirements of the GPU will allow that. So not everyone's going to be using 12-pin. Also, previously we saw some articles that got a little bit carried away in sort of mainstream tech publications, not in the enthusiast space, where there was conjecture about needing to upgrade your power supply, or in one instance there was something about needing to completely replace your system because there's going to be a 12-pin connector for a new video card. Neither of those is really true. As long as you have sufficient power provided by the power supply, you won't need to replace it just because of the cable. You can get an adapter for this, and assuming your power supply is already of adequate capacity, you're going to be fine. That said, though, we have some information on the power requirements in a story a little bit later in this video about Seasonic and its 12-pin. So additionally, there's no indication that the 12-pin will appear on anything other than NVIDIA's Halo GPU right now, and that's probably going to be called 3090. Moreover, as usual, partners are, again, free to use what they want. And lastly, there's some discussion on NVIDIA's new cooler design in the video that NVIDIA launched. This is intended to balance both mechanical and thermal function for the video card. NVIDIA didn't offer many details, but it did focus on its shorter PCB design and how it's pulling air from one side of the card and pushing it out the other, which is a bit of a different approach than what we typically see, at least in reference designs. Certainly, though, there have been cards in the past that we've reviewed even recently where the heatsink overhangs past the PCB on the right with the fan in the traditional bottom orientation if it's in a standard ATX configuration, and the air blows straight through the heatsink and out the other side, or into a backplate, depending on the design. So it's not entirely a new thing, but putting it on the other side of the card and reorienting the fins is what changes stuff, and that's what we'll be looking at in our review once we get it in. And finally, we won't have to wait too long for more details on this because NVIDIA has an official announcement event scheduled for September 1st, and that's probably going to be for these cards almost certainly. Next up, we previously reported on the new Aurora supercomputer that is being built for Argonne National Laboratory. That's a supercomputer that specifically marketed itself as being American-made and proud of its source for supplies being mostly American or entirely American companies. And this information will become relevant because of just how Intel has flubbed the delivery on it. So now, Intel has managed to drop the ball on this $500 million project for the Department of Energy. Intel CEO Bob Swan has recently been the face of several announcements of Intel delays, and one of the latest was a 12-month delay for CPUs slated for the new supercomputer, and, better still, that those CPUs are likely to be manufactured by a fab not owned by Intel. That's probably going to be TSMC. When Intel recently discussed how it's moving some of its manufacturing to TSMC, we'd assume that this was potentially included in that list. This is one of the worst combinations for a nasty PR hit for Intel. It's just all of the things add up in a way that makes it particularly bad, whereas otherwise it would just be, oh, well, Intel's delayed a thing again. That's not a surprise. But this is a computer that's meant to be marketed as American-made and showing American innovation. It was very proud of this in its original marketing materials. It also was heavily discussed back when there were new supercomputers in China getting booted up or spec'd out for the first time. So now that it looks like Intel might have to rely on other fabs, potentially TSMC in Taiwan for its silicon, and the fact that it's delayed 12 months further, Intel's got a new PR issue to deal with. Further still, Aurora is particularly interesting because it's built primarily, or at least in the marketing materials that have been put out thus far, it's built for things like researching Alzheimer's disease or a traumatic brain injury, things that actually help humanity and aren't entirely driven by military use, which is what a lot of the supercomputers are currently slated for use and for researching. So all these things together, you've got a supercomputer that's meant to do a lot of good. You have it marketed on being at least in some ways made in the US, or at least using silicon made in the US. And you've got the delays, the lack of silicon, all this stuff adding together. It's not a good time for Intel right now, but we'll follow up on Aurora as it gets closer to completion. It was supposed to be a PR home run, but it didn't really seem to play out quite that way for Intel. Next up, Cryorig secret cooler coming out. Cryorig is a cooling company that picked up a lot of popularity a couple years ago. They did some partnerships with other companies in the space that helped this, like working with NZXT back in the day, and it sort of suddenly vanished from retailers, at least in the US market, for a long time. That was following the tariffs when they really came into place, and it has mostly extended. Now, there's still some Cryorig bits and pieces out there that you can buy, but in no shape is the company selling in the capacity that it was a couple years ago when it was at its height of popularity. Now, though, it looks like, thanks to one image, Cryorig might be coming back with a cooler in its potentially H5 series, as evidenced by the fact that the one image that Cryorig posted says Foon, or 5 un. We're not sure what that word exactly says, but maybe it's a hexadecimal joke. Maybe it's like the Silicon Valley. What's 9 times F? It's 75. We don't know exactly what Foon could mean, or 5 un, or whatever Cryorig's image says, but surely it must be a cooler because of the silhouette. There's really nothing to go on for this one. That is an official image from the company. It's not a rumor or a leak. If you were wondering, hey, where'd Cryorig go? They made some interesting stuff that I liked a couple years ago. Maybe they'll be coming back, and we'll definitely add their cooler to our test bench with our air coolers of comparable size to the H5 series or whatever this is going to be when it comes out. Seasonic and its NVIDIA 12-pin PCIe Molex MicroFit 3.0 connector were revealed accidentally. And a bit more news regarding the 12-pin connectors for NVIDIA's Ampere GeForce cards in probably the 3000 series. It looks like some additional images of the connector and cables have surfaced. Previously, partner Micron has done NVIDIA the favor of leaking specifications on its product, and now Seasonic is piling on just to make sure Jensen is really sweating in his leather jacket more than usual about the upcoming launch and trying to have something he can still reveal on stage to the people that hasn't been leaked at this point. These particular images are from Seasonic and were found on the Bilibili forums by Twitter user HXL. If you're not familiar with it, Bilibili is sort of like a YouTube alternative in China. The images show what appears to be a legitimate Seasonic box, replete with what Seasonic is calling an NVIDIA 12P cable. This is a 2x8 pin to 1x12 pin connector. The images do seem to suggest that a single 12P or 12-pin connector isn't much bigger than a traditional 8-pin, as we would expect from the previous news item. Also noteworthy is a label on the cable's box saying, quote, "It is recommended to use a power supply rated 850 watts or higher with this cable." Before anyone goes and buys a 1000 watt power supply for this, maybe just wait a little bit for the testing numbers and see what comes out, because some of the information we've seen out there, we've seen everything from these are 300 watt cards to these are 800 watt cards. And certainly on both ends of that, there's some crazy going on. So we'll get the power testing done for you at the PCIe connectors and at the PCIe slot like we always do. That way you'll have a full picture of just the GPU power when it comes out. So we'd recommend waiting on the power supply purchase, but it will be a bit higher than probably is typically expected. Next up, this one's a big news item on Corsair filing for an IPO and looking to go public. It seems that Corsair wants to go public following in the footsteps of Razer, and that's according to new information from both Forbes and from Corsair's own S1 form filing. There are a couple interesting things to glean from Corsair's IPO filing. First, Corsair has been on a buying spree the last couple of years. As you all likely know, it's acquired Origin PC recently, it acquired Elgato, it acquired Scuff, and that's just to name a few of the interests Corsair has had outside of its core space. As it's bought several new business segments under its corporate umbrella, Corsair is showing some obvious losses from those transactions. However, Corsair is still a billion-dollar company somehow. Specifically, Corsair managed to earn $1 billion in revenue from 2019. Corsair also highlights that it made around $23 million in profit just between January 2020 and June 2020 alone. So the margin isn't terribly high for the overall business, especially given the recent purchases where they're still kind of transitioning things. But Corsair does have some very high margin segments, like peripherals, for example. A few highlights of note here. Corsair is estimated to have 18% of the gaming peripheral market in the US. Corsair is estimated to have 42% of the PC component market in the US. Corsair claims to have a #1 market share position for the following product segments. And this is, again, a Corsair claim, so keep that in mind. It says keyboards, DRAM modules, cases, power supplies, and cooling solutions. Kingston has traditionally been one of Corsair's biggest competitors. Corsair also says it has shipped 190 million gaming and streaming products as of June 30th, 2020, and it says DRAM still accounts for almost half of its business. Memory revenue accounted for 43.7%, 41.8%, and 39.1% of Corsair's revenue for 2017, 18, and 19, respectively. Further, Corsair relies heavily on Amazon, and its customer base is limited. Quote, in 2017, 2018, 2019, and for the 6 months ended June 30th, 2020, sales to Amazon accounted for 17.7%, 22.4%, 25.1%, and 26.8% respectively of our net revenue. And sales to our 10 largest customers accounted for 43.4%, 51%, 51.6%, and 52.4% of the same periods respectively of our net revenue, end quote. Corsair also had a really interesting take on cloud computing, mostly in that it seems to not quite know the difference, or at least the financial people who authored this document, not quite know the difference between cloud computing and cloud gaming as it stands now. This quote is from Corsair's filing, and it addresses the risk factors that it faces as a business, of which it considers cloud computing, again, to be one of them. So, quote, cloud computing refers to computing environments in which software is run on a third-party service and accessed by end users over the internet. In a cloud computing environment, a user's computer may be the so-called dumb terminal, with minimal processing power and limited need for high-performance components. Through cloud computing, gamers will be able to access and play graphically sophisticated games. That's some investor wording there, that may or may not otherwise be able to be played on a PC that is not fully equipped with the necessary and often expensive hardware. Just a note in the middle of this quote that that's the hardware Corsair sells, at least largely. It continues, it says, if cloud computing is widely accepted, the demand for high-performance computer gaming hardware products such as PC, high-performance memory, pre-built and custom gaming PCs and laptops, and other PC gaming components we sell could diminish significantly, end quote. So we get their meaning. Cloud computing is, however, widely accepted, but obviously they mean cloud gaming. At any rate, we'll keep an eye on this as it develops. It's possible that before the year is over, Corsair could actually be a publicly traded company. TSMC up next with its Technology Symposium 2020. TSMC recently shared some details regarding its 5nm and 3nm process developments at its annual Technology Symposium. TSMC also discussed a new branding effort for its various packaging technologies, and also how it may be ditching silicon for sub-3nm designs. TSMC is still working on 7nm and recently shared that it has shipped over 1 billion 7nm dies. TSMC has extensively used its N7 and N7P nodes, and we're still looking ahead to N7+, which will mark the first use of EUV for critical layers. N7+ is currently in volume production, and TSMC is looking down the road to N6, which will be an IP-compatible node offering an 18% density improvement. Moving on to 5nm, TSMC will extend the use of EUV, or extreme ultraviolet lithography, even further. While TSMC didn't offer numbers, it's believed N5 will use 11 to 13 EUV masks. N5 is currently ramping into volume production and should provide a 15% performance increase at ISO power, or a 30% reduction at ISO performance compared to N7. The first 5nm designs to ship may be Apple's A14 Bionic SoC for the iPhone 12. TSMC is also working on an N5P node that will offer iterative performance and power improvements similar to N7P. TSMC also shared some light news about its N4 node, which will offer undisclosed power and performance improvements over N5 and N5P. N4 is scheduled to enter risk production in late 2021, with volume production coming online in 2022. For 3nm, TSMC's N3 will be a full node advancement from N5 and claims to offer a 10 to 15% performance improvement at ISO power and a 25 to 30% reduction in power consumption at ISO performance compared to N5. TSMC states that N3 will offer a 1.7x density improvement over N5 previously, and that N3 will continue to use FinFET solutions for its transistors. However, it's possible that N3 may be TSMC's last node to make use of conventional silicon. For sub-3 nanometers, TSMC is looking into other materials as alternatives to silicon in an effort to maintain scaling as transistor geometry continues to shrink. TSMC is currently using and researching materials like nanosheets and nanowires, carbon nanotubes, and 2D transistors. TSMC also debuted the 3D Fabric brand, which looks to bring all of TSMC's 3D packaging technologies like chip on wafer on substrate, or CoW-OS, as we are now calling it, and chip on wafer, or CoW, under one roof. In the last couple stories here, a product announcement from MSI, it looks like maybe some from ASUS, and then JPR's market report. First up with MSI and what's already a crowded market, MSI has decided to throw its hat into the power supply ring. As a note, this isn't going to alleviate any supply issues you may have noticed in your region for power supplies, because the actual suppliers who make the things are at max capacity more or less already. Either way though, MSI's MPG-GF series will span 3 models initially. These include the A650GF, A750, and the A850. As you may have guessed, these are 650, 750, and 850 watts, so at least these names are more predictable than the monitor names that MSI uses. MSI's MPG-GF series are all 80+ gold certified power supplies. They are all of modular design, and they all come with a 10-year warranty, at least as we know now. All of MSI's MPG-GF PSUs will come with these standard heavy-duty protections: OVP, OCP, OPP, OTP, SCP, UVP, and another 3-letter initialism, an FDB, which is just a bearing for a fan. MSI didn't share any details on who the OEM is for these units as of now. Typically that'd be HEC, Channelwell, Superflower, or other similar companies, or its pricing. It also appears MSI will be bundling the power supplies with a 12-pin microfit 3.0 cable, similar to what we saw from Seasonic, which is the more interesting aspect of this. MSI didn't reveal any dates for release at this time either, but we'd expect the release date to coincide with NVIDIA's upcoming cards next week when they are announced. Next up, ASUS appears to be teasing something via its ROG Twitter account, where news happens these days. The tweet shows what clearly looks to be a keyboard switch, but it links to an event page with a countdown timer. So here's our proposal for ASUS. We think ASUS, some software company needs to make a timer software that counts down to the announcement of an announcement, because that is the future of product announcements, we think. It's all been timers for the last week now, so we've had enough timers to not even know what the thing is. The event page is called the ROG Meta Buffs, and the countdown coincides with at least one of them, NVIDIA's upcoming GeForce event scheduled for next Tuesday, September 1st. Separately, ASUS is also teasing another event with yet another countdown timer. This time, the event is called Built for Brilliance, and it's targeted for September 2nd, the day after NVIDIA's GeForce event will happen. This event seems to have something to do with Intel, though, so it may be unrelated to NVIDIA entirely. If we're offering some speculation here, it seems like the ROG special event could herald the arrival of ROG-branded mechanical keyboard switches. Not necessarily that they manufacture those, but that they've done some sort of at least pseudo-engineering on it, if not rebranding only, on mechanical switches for their own devices. We'd also expect some ROG-branded RTX 3000 cards, clearly, because that's the major news coming up. The Built for Brilliance event is one that we're not as sure about. It's probably a bit more device-focused, maybe laptops for Intel's upcoming announcements, like convertibles and things of that nature. Up next, JPR. John Petty Research has released an overview of its Q2 2020 GPU market report. While the full report is obviously paywalled, JPR does make some highlights available for free. JPR notes that overall, GPU shipments are up 2.5% quarter over quarter. Specifically, AMD's shipments are up 8.4% over last quarter. NVIDIA's shipments have increased by 17.8%, according to the JPR free version of the report. Intel's shipments have decreased 2.7%. The overall attach rate for GPUs to PCs, or what JPR calls basically installing a GPU into a computer, was 126% for quarter 2 of 2020, and that's up 2.3% quarter over quarter. If you're not quite certain how a computer can have over a 100% attach rate for video cards, the way JPR does it, this is old news now, but it's been a while since we've said it. What they do is they take how many GPUs are in a system, and then that counts towards it. So if everybody in the world used SLI, you'd be looking at a 200% attach rate, for example. JPR also, though, often includes IGPs, so that would be potentially AMD APUs or Intel IGPs in a lot of its reports. It does these days break them out individually as well. So if you go look at their report, which we'll link in the show notes below, be sure to keep an eye on if the chart is referring to IGPs or not. That is where people typically get thrown off, because if it includes IGPs in there, then what happens is Intel ends up with a significant market share of the GPUs, and that's not really how our community thinks of it, but it is how JPR looks at it from a more business standpoint. So then, the overall PC market has increased 0.68% quarter over quarter and 12.54% year over year, which is actually a pretty big change considering previous downtrends we've seen. JPR notes that usually the second quarter of the year is down or remains flat. Yet the impact of the pandemic has had interesting effects on the PC market and especially the gaming market. Quote, "The pandemic has been disruptive and had varying effects on the market. Some sales that might have occurred in quarter 3, such as notebooks for back-to-school season, have been pulled into quarter 2, while desktop sales declined. Intel's manufacturing challenges have also negatively affected desktop sales. We believe the stay-at-home orders have continued to increase demand in spite of the record-setting unemployment levels. As economies open up, consumer confidence will be an important metric to watch," says John Petty, the president of JPR. As for total DGPU market share, JPR finds that NVIDIA now commands 80% of that market and says that AMD holds the remaining 20%. Matrox, unfortunately, not included in this one, or included at 0.0 something. Maybe there's a 100th or a 1,000th place in there. This marks a 5% gain for NVIDIA at this point, a 5% decrease for AMD in terms of the previous quarter stats. And that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. As always, subscribe for more. You can go to store.gamersnexus.net to help us out directly by buying things like our medium mod mats, which are in stock and shipping now, or our wireframe mouse mats, among other things. Or you can go to patreon.com/gamersnexus for bonus episodes of Patrons Ask GN. Thanks for watching. We'll see you all next time.